Oh, and welcome to Cloudy with a Chance of Insights, a bi-weekly podcast focused on all things Microsoft Cloud. This week, we have got a packed session. David is going to be covering off a number of items, including classifying human AI interactions at scale from Microsoft Research, Windows backup for organizations, again, which is now in public preview, I believe, Windows 2030 Vision for Agentic AI OS, Microsoft 365 Copilot for GCC High or DoD, and Cyrus is going to talk through the recent SharePoint on-prem hack, which I think is going to be interesting. And I'm going to cover off a little bit about a new announcement from Microsoft around Sentinel Data Lake / Graph, which we've actually had a little bit of a sneak preview for at IBM as well. So I'll cover off a little bit of that later on from what I'm allowed to. As to everything else, obviously, it's obvious that we've been off air for a little while, primarily due to annual leaves for both Cyrus, David, and myself. Also, I had to take a little bit of an emergency leave of absence a couple of weeks ago due to a family emergency, which did give me the opportunity to experience the wonders that is the National Health Service in the UK. So for those of you who are listening from outside of the UK, the NHS is our free, in inverted commas, health service, although we do pay for it every month through something called national insurance and a few other taxes and everything else. But it does do a sterling job considering what it is. However, the experience I had with a family member that was put into A&E or ER or whatever the other acronym might be for wherever you're listening to, was really interesting. So I'm not going to dwell on too much of the being treated in corridors and the waiting around, all that sort of stuff, because I think that's not necessarily for what we're talking about here. But, and I did mention this to David and Cyrus earlier in the week, what struck me the most is that whilst we were there and this person was admitted into hospital as well, I think we saw 8 different doctors. So ranging from junior doctors all the way through to like a senior consultant. And at no point during any of those examinations, whatever you want to call it, did anybody put anything into a single record system. So either an iPad or some other portable device or even like a dictaphone, for goodness sake, was all done on scraps of paper. And I was sat there watching this going, how on earth does this work in practice? I mean, the staff at NHS hospitals, especially in A&E, are overworked. They don't have time to go and make notes afterwards. I don't know quite how they managed to get that continuity of care. So I was amazed that they managed to do anything realistically based on what I was seeing with the processes. Now, I think that in the UK, there's definitely a lot of fuss about the recent win by Palantir around the sort of data system that I think David is probably much more aware of than I am. But I do wonder what the benefit of having a big data sort of lake system for the NHS is going to be if we've got people running around with scraps of paper. But anyway, that was a complete aside. But it does worry me sometimes when I experience these things and think, well, actually, we've got all these tools that we've got available, and yet we've still got people, which is a life and death situation in some instances, running around with little scraps of paper where they've written handwritten notes on. But I'll pass that open to anybody else who wants to comment. But yeah, that was an eye opener for me last week. Excellent. Okay, before we crack into the main topics, is there anything that anybody wants to share from the last time we were actually on air?
I think David, you wanted to share something, but you're on mute.
Yeah, no, I was going to talk about the NHS thing, and honestly, Richard, my memory doesn't extend that far back, so I genuinely can't comment on what we said. But I was going to say and thank you for pointing it out, Cyrus, appreciate it. There are so many tools that Microsoft have, right? So they've got sort of the ambient voice, so all the who started with an N, the capability that Microsoft. Nuance, yeah, all the nuance capabilities. There's a bunch of health stuff that lives in there that's targeted directly for that setting. But I think the issue is you can't use that sort of thing in the setting that you said, right? If it's an emergency department of sorts, there's lots of people running around, lots of noise. It's how do you bring that sort of capability down to an individual? So I think if you're in a constrained box, whether it's a treatment room or whether it's an ambulance or whether it's something else, then it could work quite well. But when you're in those situations where you're right, you're seeing multiple people perhaps in a setting where there's quite a lot of noise, it's a super challenging issue. And I know my wife, probably sharing too much, but she's a physiotherapist and she has the same challenges, right? They have ostensibly moved to computerized notes, which is great, but it takes longer because the applications that they have are not geared towards how the setting actually works. So if you think about it, you've got a form to fill out, you write some text, you've got to click a button, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do the other. And the reality is they need to get what's in their brain out onto this thing as quickly as possible and then move on to the next one, and then move on to the next one. So I think a lot of it is that user-centered design that actually, instead of an application being created for note-taking, it's something that's geared towards how the professionals actually work. And I think that's a genuine gap that we see all over the place, right? When you use an application, it's not always geared that way. So there's work to be done.
Yeah,
for sure.
It probably doesn't help that we've got so many. Again, for people outside the UK, this is probably going to be complete gibberish. But we've got all these different trusts around that are sort of independent, even though they're being funded primarily from the same source, and there's an overall sort of governance model, for want of a better word, that governs everything. They are individual entities with own buying decisions, etc. And one of the things that struck me in this instant was that the ambulance crew or paramedics, whatever you want to call them, had like this little mobile device where they were putting all the details, the patient details in, so name, address, symptoms, an overview of what happened, etc., etc. But then when we got to the A&E department of the hospital, they basically sat next to what I'm going to call the triage nurse and read out the information that they put into this tablet device. I was just thinking, okay, if it's not one system, great. So if it's not a system that the ambulance crew are using that the hospital uses, fine. But there must be some easier way of doing some sort of some sort of NFC tap or something that will just transfer the data into that system. Because then there must be scope for mistakes there. There must be. It can't. Humans are humans.
Yeah.
If we didn't catch it, my daughter was actually registered as male by mistake by the midwife. These things happen.
And they do make a difference, right? So for sure.
But anyway, that was my one digression for the week, and I'm only allowing myself one digression this week. We'll see if that works. Well, I don't know. I tell a lie. I'm going to digress right away. So
go on then, Richard.
So I think for anybody that's been following some of the blog stuff that I've been doing recently, I've been messing about a lot with Copilot. And what I did last week is I actually took the transcript of one of our episodes, shoved it into Copilot and said, hey, give me a critique of this. And it did come back as one of the things saying the host wanders too much. It's like it should be more focused. I was like, yeah, you're probably right.
But that's part of the value, Richard. The AI doesn't understand this.
So then I just ignored that. I said, okay, ignore that. Then give me some critique that I can do something about. But anyway, so I will pass it across to David to talk about some or all of the subjects that he had. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much, and I'll be brief-ish. So the first one caught my eye because one of our colleagues is doing quite a lot of work with sort of contact center stuff, and it made me think, when you think about things like abandonment rates. So if somebody rings in and they give up because they've just waited too long or they've just not got the answer they want and stuff like that, that's pretty common when you talk about those customer service scenarios, right? Those metrics are captured to the nth degree, one would argue, I guess, right? Now, what Microsoft Research are doing is a thing that they're calling, I think it's classifying human, as you said at the top, right? And this is doing it sort of AI interactions at scale. So what it is that Microsoft Research have published this framework that I guess semanticizes. No, I don't even know if that's a word, but that helps you understand the interactions between humans and AI across products. So then, they bring, of course, a multi-layered approach, which means they look at sort of the interaction taxonomy, and this is the point I was getting at. So, what are the categories for prompts, what are the responses, how is the user correcting that response, and then the disengagement events and follow-up requests. And as more and more interaction will happen with these AI agents, potentially, right, as time moves on, then being able to understand those things is super important, because that's really, really important telemetry for a business, right? If somebody's giving up because it's just giving a crap answer, you need to be able to capture that. And at the moment, it's sort of just falls into a black hole, doesn't it? So I think it's super interesting work that they're doing to be able to do that. And then in conjunction with that, try and understand the context that that's happening. So, what's the application? What's the language? Device type? Is it a mobile? Is it a PC? Whatever, right? The accessibility elements. So again, helping understand what the user's doing, how they're doing it, and then how can you make it better, essentially, right? So I thought that super important, and it will help people make better applications. I guess exactly the point we were just having, right, on your digression about the NHS. It's a way of having measurable telemetry to help you improve the app using the Gen AI construct. So it's a Microsoft Research thing, obviously not being released, but super interesting. I like the stuff that they do, so I thought I'd share that. Number 2, Windows backup for organization. So this is in public preview now, so most people will be able to get at it if you wanted. And this is a cloud-backed migration system using Entra, obviously, joined devices, and it gives you a identity-tied backup. So things like your user profile, your system settings, file and app preferences, all tied to your Entra credentials. And this is, I guess, useful and interesting because we've been doing this in sort of VDI for a long time, right? Because it's recognized that people's preferences actually can be quite complicated sometimes, and there's quite a lot to do. Whereas, there was a shift at one point to say, well, all your data is in OneDrive, doesn't matter if your machine gets flattened. Well, to some extent, no. But how much time and effort and pain is it to get the machine back to a actual user state that you can then use your data with, right? So I think that's super interesting and worth a gander. And then the other thing was our Microsoft's Windows 2030 vision. And I remember the last one they did this. Do you remember the video, Richard, when they sort of did the Windows features sort of video? I'm not sure if you recollect it, but super interesting. You look at a lot of stuff they did, and I guess to a great extent, most of it has been realized, right, in terms of what they did. And this was a good, it wasn't long after I started at Microsoft, so probably a good 13 years ago, I think the last proper one they did. And now they're doing this 2030 vision. And of course, it's all centered around AI, shock horror. But interesting, and I think we spoke about this briefly, right? It's moving away from this sort of request response sort of things, in terms of how you're using a device, to one that will sort of proactively lot on your behalf. So I think, proactive task execution, being able to contextually pick up where you left off. And that's quite a big thing because, we're all quite busy. So if you step away, even if it's just make a coffee, right, you get back, like, what was I doing? So having an AI that sort of understands what you're doing, the context you're doing it in, and then able to carry on at that point, quite interesting. And then other things like sort of adaptive interfaces. So the UI potentially could flex and change depending on what you're doing. So, if you're doing like a whole bunch of design CAD stuff, it could sort of morph into something that's better suited for that. Whereas if you're gaming, it could be something else, so on and so forth. So that sounds super interesting. There was another adjacent thing, which is I think they're also thinking about giving a face to Copilot. I'm not sure if you've seen that as well. So there's some sort of rumors. I don't think I've seen anything on the Microsoft site, so it's more rumor based, I'll be honest. But that could be super interesting. They started too quickly with Cortana, but I think you never know. We might see Cortana back again.
Hopefully.
Apparently, and I haven't seen this, so I can't comment, but this came from one of the Verge episodes I listened to a couple of weeks ago, that there is a number of AI teams that are doing similar things. So anthropomorphizing, I think I said that correctly, the AI. So I think in Grok, there is a very interesting character that they've sort of created for you to interact with on the premium tier, which apparently, and again, I've not seen it, looks remarkably like Grimes. So those that are into the Musk piece will know that Grimes is one of his exes. As I said, no comment. I haven't seen it. Apparently it's part of the premium tier, which I am not paying for X to go onto the premium tier, but there you go. So it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
And then the last one, and in the same vein as we've been talking for a long time now about this whole sovereignty thing, it would seem, and that Microsoft are looking to deploy Copilot into GCC High and DoD, which would be interesting. Now, easy for them because they've already got an instance of 365 and everything else, right? But still, super interesting to see that they're going down that path. And then, what's the future?
Would you like a game of thermonuclear war?
I
think that was the phrase, wasn't it? Someone's going to correct me from that.
It was. Yeah.
Sorry, old person.
So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what comes of that, and then what falls out of it, isn't it? Because if they're able to get it running in a isolated environment, obviously it's not going to have the internet and all that good stuff that it does in the way it does outside. Could path the way, right, for other sort of regional capabilities, but who knows?
Yeah, it does come back through to all this sovereign cloud piece and what Microsoft is trying to do there. So unfortunately, whilst I was, I can't remember whether this was away or whilst I was running around doing hospital trips, we did have access to a session from Microsoft around the sovereign cloud piece. So I've got it recorded. So it is on my list of things to go and listen to. But there is obviously a big push in that area. Something is obviously driving that. I don't know whether it's geopolitical, whether it is just regulatory, whether they're seeing a push for repatriation of workloads, whatever it might well be. But there does seem to be a push there. And then that would go into the GCC elements and everything else. I don't know how that's going to work with the US at the moment, because obviously all of that is all up in the air with Doge and Trump. Although does Doge still exist now? I don't know, but who knows? I know
Maybe.
Elon has gone, but Doge must still be there, mustn't it? But yeah, I have no idea. Excellent. So thank you for that, David. And there is one more thing I'm going to come back to you about, which was your recent LinkedIn post where where you'll be talking about using an AI tool that I don't believe is a Microsoft AI tool. So we will have to caveat that before we go into that. So before I start my section, I do have to do the whole thing about, if you're enjoying this content, regardless of where you're consuming it from, either YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc., please like, follow, subscribe, drop us a comment. Let us know whether there's a topic that you'd like us to cover, whether there's something that you agree with, disagree with, whatever it might well be. Any comments would be happily accepted and incorporated.
Absolutely. And all our opinions, right, Richard, not representative of IBM in any way, shape, or form.
There you go. So I didn't even have to do it this time. So thank you, David, for adding that caveat in there as well. Especially as I think Cyrus didn't provide this in his update, but he has got a new role as well. So I provided my new role in the last episode, but I think Cyrus has got a new role as well. So he might cover that off later on. So even though I have a new role, which is not security related, my story this week is going to be security related. And it's primarily because this is something that that IBM, and again, this is where the caveats probably do come into play, have actually been party to the private preview of. Actually, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that, but anyway, I've said it now, so it's out there, which is the Sentinel Data Lake / graph component. So for those of you that haven't seen the announcement, which I think is about a week ago as we're recording this, which is Friday I don't know what it is, I can't read my watch, 8th of August, is Microsoft has released into public preview Sentinel Data Lake, which in effect, as the name suggests, is a data lake specifically for Sentinel that it can use to aggregate data from all sorts of different sources. So not just your traditional Sentinel logs and Sentinel data, but from things like XDR, from Entra, from other applications as well. The idea being, in theory anyway, is that you will be able to have a much more comprehensive view of the data when you're looking for any anomalous activity within your environment. So whether that's a hack, whether that's some sort of probing sort of activity, whether it's just weird user behavior, whatever it might well be. Now, there are a few things that people need to think about around this. One of which is actually, what are you going to try and ingest? And obviously Microsoft support a load of stuff out of the box, but you can add to that structure if you want to. So if you've got your own login information, you're running different tools, for example, or you want to try and look at other elements that might be in Azure, you can sort of ingest that into the data lake as well. Now, one of the things that came up in when I was talking to a colleague earlier on in the week about this is, oh my God, Sentinel's data storage is really expensive. Is this not just going to triple the storage costs? Now, I did see quite a nice article actually on LinkedIn earlier in the week, which actually went through this in a lot more detail than I'm going to cover off now. So if I'll try and find that article, and I'll put the link into the show notes. But in effect, there's two different tiers that you're using, very similar to, as opposed to a sort of hot, cold sort of storage tier here. So you've got the analytics tier, which is basically the Sentinel data tier. So that's where you would do your standard queries, visualizations, alerts, and everything else will come through that. And most of the existing connectors go into that tier. So your Entra XDR tier go in there by default. Then you've got the data lake tier, which is a much more sort of, I suppose I would call that the sort of more archived one, but that's where the sort of analysis and the querying goes into everything else. And then what Microsoft have done is they've put a graph sort of over the top of this as well, which catchily names the Sentinel graph at the moment. And that allows the sort of more analytical AI components sort of start to look at the different bits and draw inferences and start querying up off different data stuff. So this, in theory, is, again, something that IBM is quite interested in, generally speaking, not just within the Microsoft space, which is the aggregation of all this data that we're sort of collating and generating anyway. And it might not necessarily be from security tools. So you might be ingesting data from an application log or something else like that, which then gives you the ability to actually, as I say, have this holistic view across your organization, that from tools that might not be security tools, but that can be fed into a security viewpoint. So that, I believe, now is in public preview. So anybody that's in the security space, go and have a look at. And so that setting up was actually relatively easy. It was like about 3 or 4 clicks in the Defender portal. So really quite simple to set up. You do also need to know KQL because that's the primary source of this, but it does support Jupyter notebooks as well. So anybody who's got a load of that sort of technology or pieces lying around, they can leverage some of that. And yeah, it's there now. So go and have a play with it if you're interested. Which now neatly, I think, at least anyway, leads me on to Cyrus, who's going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is SharePoint, but possibly not necessarily in the in the context that I would like to hear SharePoint being mentioned. But over to you, Cyrus.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And for the last thing about the data lake, the KQL, they invented the KQL jobs. So it's easy now to use the auxiliary logs. We don't use auxiliary logs, it's the data lake logs for doing KQL jobs. So once a day, and it's still cheaper than having the hot code and to do the archiving. So it's an excellent news. I invite everyone to go investigate that. There's plenty of news online. It's very interesting. And yeah, sorry for the news about SharePoint. Actually, I didn't know what I wanted to share today. There was plenty of interesting subjects like API permissions, exploits, people sharing on Slack kind of keys, etc. I wanted to talk more about this, but we all have plenty of news on the tabs, and we try to focus. And there were some keywords, and I like David. You mentioned the World War III, and actually that's the keyword I was like triggered by, and I did some investigation, and that's the story I want to talk about. It happened mainly, I think, last month. If I'm not mistaken, actually exactly last month. So at date of recording. So the context in May 2025 at the Pwn2Own contest in Berlin. It's like it's like a contest, a hackathon. If you want to, where pen testers, experts in cybersecurity, or just random people just come and try to exploit different systems, including Microsoft. And in that case, a Vietnamese researcher named, and I'm sorry if I pronounce it badly, Dinh Ho Han Koa, showed a working exploit against Microsoft SharePoint. So it's a classic thing. Every time we discover some issues, you notify Microsoft, and in that case, he won $100,000. So it was a pretty good one, not the most expensive price, but a good one. And then there was a 60-day clock to patch, which is already too long, in my personal opinion. And the plan backfired. So Microsoft has a long-running early warning system called MAP. So it's Microsoft Active Protection Program. And only trusted partners get access to some patch in, let's say, 24 hours before the release. So defenders can prepare. But as you expect, on the July 7th, last month, just as partners were briefed, attackers began to exploiting the flow. So the overlap was very suspicious. At the same day they released that, like the next few hours, there was some exploit. So Microsoft now is probing whether a partner leak lit the fuse, but it's the third time that happened. So personally, I think that program will vanish, because that's the conclusion I wanted to make. So Microsoft shipped fixes, so patch Tuesday in early July, but the first patch didn't really fully close the hole, which is catastrophic. So within days, compromise spread, and we saw Linen Typhoon and Violet Typhoon, which is China linked, and you will see why it matters, started to exploit it. And later, Storm 2603, we saw all the news, pushed ransomware. Internet scans showed thousands of exposed SharePoint servers. Roughly 400 orgs were hit, including the US Nuclear Weapons Agency. And I was like, no, it's not possible. So I checked, and actually I had multiple questions. Were those servers internet facing? And to my horror, yes. And I was like, maybe the US Nuclear Weapons Agency is just like a public agency. It is not. They have access to some locations, and they have to make sure that because it's a thing to have nuclear weapons, but if you can't launch them, they're useless. So they make sure that they can still launch on there. I'm not sure if I can talk too much about those things, but it's actually a pretty big news. So what exactly broke? Researchers call the chain tool shell. So if I pronounce it badly, tool shell. It combines an auth bypass with unsafe deserialization for an authenticated RC, so a remote control exploit on-prem SharePoint, all the versions. So 2016, 2019, and the subscription edition. SharePoint Online obviously wasn't affected, but doesn't mean it's completely safe. Huh? So I was asking questions. I had to use there's actually I digress. That's my first digression, and I hope you're happy with that. I don't digress too much, but my first question, and I'll ask the ChatGPT 5 this morning, because it was released for me, the ChatGPT 5, the newly intelligent tool from OpenAI. And I said, okay, was it internet facing? Was it air gapped? Because I could not believe those were public facing. And this is like mostly internet facing servers. That's why the blast radius was so wide. So if you went on a public internet, or if you published with SharePoint behind a strong pre-auth, your odds were far better. So there's three concepts I got from that. And the first one, I make it's not probably the first one, but I say in this order. It was my concept of zero trust supply chain, because you can't trust partners anymore. And the partner program meant to help defenders likely helped the attackers. Lesson, you have to only share signals, not secrets. Because they literally share the patch, how it works, so they could exploit it straight to the point. You don't have to read how the analyst did the thing 60 days ago. You can say, okay, this is the patch. So we assume this is not patch, because obviously we're the only one to know that, and you exploit. You have to limit who sees pre-release details, gate access by telemetry and behavior. That one I'm less sure, because I'm sure those Chinese government backed, I mean, it's pretty strong words, we don't know yet, but those corrupted partners, I'm sure they were on a safe internet and safe place, and it's really hard to have telemetry, but it's a good thing to do. And stage rollout with canary rings, so you don't harm the bad actors. That's really opinionated, sorry. The next one, which is for me my favorite, it's if you must run SharePoint on-prem, don't leave it naked on the internet. Put it behind Microsoft Entra application proxy or Entra private access. So every request, it's pre-authentication. That's very important. Pre-authentication and condition access before SharePoint ever sees it. That's a big speed bump for unauthorized RCE chains. And the next one is add a WAF. So you can do virtual patch rules for subscription path like /_layout on weird posts. So we saw that actually online. I was checking, several vendors already shipped tool shell rules within the days, within the first day. Lock egress, rotate machine keys, enable AMSCI plus Defender antivirus, and hunt for dropped web shell as Microsoft advised. So if you look for Microsoft Security Response Center, they advise that it's easy to say today, it's easy, because at our position, nothing happened to us. But it's common sense, and that's why I wanted to link it after with Sentinel. And I was like, okay, but there was the MFA that was bypassed. That was more concerning. So right, because the attackers got server-side RCE before identity checks. So make your front door pre-auth again. So that's why we talk about Entra app proxy and private access. So then you can pair that with phishing-resistant MFA. We discussed that before. And even device compliance. So tokens are device bound. So even if you have SharePoint on-prem and you must have that, you can have device bound token, and it mitigate the risk. And last time we also talked about, so I know you like SharePoint, Richard, but last time we talked about some clients can't, but normally you should, if you're public facing, that's my opinion. I'm not sure if I can say that. You can contradict me if I'm wrong, but if you have public facing, maybe you should move to SharePoint Online. If you can't for some reason, and I'm sure there's reasons, there will be Microsoft 365 local. That is more designed, I understand, for sovereign cloud, more European clients, etc. I understand, but you have easier options to use Azure local, and then you can. It's not native, but you can make it air gapped. So you can share whatever you want to share. It's not magically done, but you can apply pre-auth, WAF, and segmentation, and easier. I'm sure it's true. So yeah, sorry.
I was going to say SharePoint is an interesting beast, and both myself and David, when we were at Microsoft, worked for a particular organization. I won't go into any details, but they decided that they wanted to have a SharePoint knowledge management system, which I architected. The architecture, by the way, was really, really, really amazing, really complicated. There was just one problem with it. It didn't bloody work. So that's one day I'll go through and explain why that was the case. But in effect, and I don't know if David ever spoke to him, but we spoke to, I can't remember if it was a CISO or just somebody within the CISO's team. And he basically said, look, this is going to be public facing because we want people to be able to, from like embassies and everything else, to come. Well, I've probably just given away which department it is. Damn, might have to blank that out. They might have to come in and access this information, et cetera, et cetera. So what we did is we actually had 2 SharePoint files, one internally, so behind the DMZ, and then one sat within the DMZ. And the CISO or whatever his role was say, look, we just assume that foreign actors are in the DMZ. We just assumed that. So in effect, it's zero trust because they assumed breach. Yeah. So what they did is that SharePoint site was basically there as a, not necessarily like as a dummy, but it was just there and they sort of knew that it was going to be attacked. So although these were linked, it was only a push. So you couldn't come from the DMZ back into the internal network. You could only go from the internal network into the DMZ. And there was a whole heap of stuff over there, some F5s, some UAG servers, other firewalls and stuff like that around it. But I thought that was an interesting approach because it basically meant that if the SharePoint server was compromised in any way, in theory, you couldn't get from there back into the internal SharePoint site.
No. And that's the point. When I was doing my research, what you architected, you said it didn't work. But if you done that, it would have been a speed bump, even for 0 days. Like it will have blocked natively. There's ways to do. It's easy to make the theory here, but what you design seems more complex and intelligent than what I've seen. This public organization being attacked. So that's why it's.
It didn't work because of SharePoint content query web parts, because we followed best practices, which meant you had a site collection for each of the individual sites, but you had to be authenticated to use this content query web part to go to retrieve content from another site collection. But obviously, when you first hit the landing page, you're only authenticated against that site collection. So everything else, all the other web parts that were pointing to other site collections, were blank. And we only found this out, again, I'm sort of exposing myself here to ridicule, because we did the development in one site collection and we only started to use the multiple site collections when we went into UAT, and that's when we found the problem. So we ended up having to do this whole pre-authentication piece. So we authenticated against all the site collections on first entry in order to get the content query web parts to work. Anyway, that was the gist of it. So that's why it didn't work.
That's very interesting. I was thinking at the same time, we have to talk about those things because this is going to happen again. And just to link it with what you discussed before, the Sentinel Data Lake actually matters in that case. I know it's a bit weird to link it with the Sentinel, but Sentinel now lets you park auxiliary logs in Data Lake, as Richard said. It's cheap, long retention, and still queryable with KQL, which is the big difference. Because before you had to go back to the analytic logs. So instead of staying in the auxiliary logs, so that's a big thing. In the Defender portal, so it's all in one place. That means you can hunt across months or years without bankrupting your SIEM build. So what would we automate for Toolshell on the 0 days in general? A daily KQL job over IIS SharePoint logs for unusual posts to /layout or tool pane at SPX, and sudden spikes in 500s or 401s. But that was the indicator that was used, as I understood, by multiple vendors. You can do a hunt for the new SPX files in SharePoint, and you can check a specific path. I'll do a blog, and I'll literally do it today and post that in the blog, so it's easy to share. And you have plenty of examples. Spin installed at SPX. You can do an alert on w3wp.exe and PowerShell.exe. You can do all these kind of analytics with Sentinel on these new data lakes. And automation, if found, you can isolate the host via Defender, rotate machine keys, and even trigger a Copilot generated incident summary, plus suggested queries for responders. But that's the cool thing, because as you said, zero trust, we have to assume, but the concept of zero trust supply chains is the most important for me. We can't anymore live in that case. This wasn't just a bug, it was a trust failure. So the fix isn't only patching faster, it's zero trusting the supply chain. Pre-auth, as you discussed about your architecture on-prem, pre-auth at the edge, and keeping years of cheap logs. that's the best news, actually, the data lake. So we can prove, not guess, what happened.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cyrus, for sharing that insights.
Super.
So unless David wanted to contribute to that one, I think we're in a position now. We pass back to David to talk about a non-Microsoft tool. So I'm going to cover my ears for the next X number of minutes whilst he talks about his. I think you said Claude, didn't you, David? So
it was a Microsoft tool because it was in Visual Studio Code. So I think
okay, good. We are covered
Code,
there,
which is entirely a Microsoft tool. So
anyway, floor is all yours.
Thank you. So to set the scene, I was pulled into a project where the customer wants to look at potentially moving from a popular integration services platform that's a SaaS product into Microsoft Azure integration services capabilities. Now, to do that, obviously you need to have, as in all migration activities, right? You need to understand the current state in order to be able to describe what the target state is going to be. And, there was a choice. The choice was, do we just send a person off to document something that hundreds and hundreds of integrations, which is obviously time consuming. It's problematic in that they might not catch everything. They might miss something, they might write something down wrong. There's a whole ream of human error that is possible in that scenario. Or if the SaaS platform supported it, could we get that programmatically? And I'm a huge fan of trying to make sure that whatever you do is reusable in some way, shape, or form. So whatever I do, one of the first questions I ask myself is, can we do this again, and can it be a benefit to someone else, right? So I had a bit of a poke at said platform. I got myself a demo account and I logged in and I saw they had APIs, and the APIs exposed a whole wealth of information. I was like, ooh, might be able to get it. But then I was like, I'm not a developer. Never have been, probably never will be. But I am. I like to think a reasonable architect, right? So I was able to use Visual Studio Code with Claude Sonnet 4 in agent mode, and I was able to, I wrote down everything that I wanted it to do. Right, this is what I'm trying to do. This is our command. And it did a really, really good job of across the period of about 7 days, although they were very long days, dare I say. But over that period, I got to a working capability that hoovered out all the data, put it into a local SQL database, and then I was able to do some analytics against that and some reporting locally. So I was able to go from having nothing to having a very I called it beautiful. That was the prompt I used, actually. Give me a beautiful report. And you know what? Because I was doing Markdown and Word documents and Excel documents, like typical, right, nitty-gritty. But I was like, you need to be able to tell a story with this data, right? And being able to tell a story means it needs to be visual and easy to consume and understandable and all that good stuff. So yeah, I created 3 dashboards, one of the current state, one of what we think potentially based on what we saw, and sort of P times Q things in terms of how much we think it would take per category of integration, because we sort of simple, medium, complex that we categorize them as. And then the last report was based on all that data, okay, how much would that cost? So I had a list of Azure services that I was going to use tied to integrations. I then used the Azure Retail API to get those live. So I was able to go to the Retail API and say, give me a price for Logic Apps, blah, 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 all that stuff. A WAF, the various other bits and bobs that you need, Key Vault and stuff. And then out of that popped another report that was all based on data. So I managed to, from that journey over 7 days, I don't think I would have done it with a developer. I don't think I never would have done it on my own, because like I say, I'm not a developer at all. Being in control of what happens and how it works, and then being able to work through it, was super, super interesting exercise. And I've just started another one. So my Intel NUC has a vulnerability. So it uses something called WinRing 0, which is a hardware sensor thing, so it can dive into sensors and pull information out. Seems like there's a bit of vulnerability with that, and Microsoft Defender has gone a bit skits on my machine because a lot of people complaining about it. A lot of people saying, "Is this fake?" But I think there is a genuine vulnerability. The likelihood is super remote. But anyway, so I've started to see, well, can I write my version of that into Linux Software Studio to see what happens? And I've got a UI, and it looks all right. It doesn't actually do anything yet. But the point is being able to move from that idea to the initial concept of something working. I mean, it's astonishing how quick. I wouldn't say it's easy because you still have to do a lot of the thinking and the guidance and the everything else, right? And I had many instances where it just barfed the file so badly we had to stop and go back to backup. Go back to a backup that I had, and there wasn't always a backup, and then I had to try and reconstitute it. So I got 10:30 at night, sitting in front of something that's gone horribly wrong. I got super frustrated quite a few times. I'll be honest.
That sounds like my life as a developer.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, super interesting exercise. So I mean, go experiment is what I'd say, because it's such an enabler for individuals, right? To be able to, whether it's differentiate yourself or, well, no, it is differentiation, isn't it? Really,
You have to.
It's not going to make you an expert, though. I'll say that up front. But it'll help you.
I mean, I am conscious that we're running long as usual, but I think this is the way that things are going to be going forward. Or at least that's the vision I think that a lot of the AI companies have got, is that it is going to be, I'm not sure that I'd call that vibe coding or not, but it is that sort of piece of a non-coder going, okay, right, I need to create a solution that does X, Y, and Z, and then working through the different outputs of that over a period of time until you get to something that works to a level that you need it to. So yeah, we'll see what happens with that, but I think that's a really good example of how we can use some of these tools to help us in our day-to-day job, and then make it reusable. Absolutely, which is something that we do need to talk about offline, because we need to have some sort of code repo that we can leverage some of these things for. Anyway, that's a separate topic.
Yeah, the subject is really interesting because I read your blog, David, on the prompt even you shared. It was make me a gorgeous. You used the word gorgeous report, and my first love was data engineering, and I used to be a developer a bit, and Oracle, that was my first interesting company, and one of the most threatened IT job by AI is all these kind of people who understand data and create reports, even make the design of those reports. And from what you described with the Sonnet, that's actually accessible. And it just remind me one story why this is going to change for the next 10 years. When I used to study for the equivalent of the, I think, A-level, it's called baccalaureate in France, I use Google so much. And I remember a lot of teachers were against Google. Like today, the teachers usually are against AI because we also that post everywhere on LinkedIn, social medias, wherever, on TV, of the brain, the MIT research, the brain of someone who use ChatGPT and the brain of someone who use, for example, Google and research. But I remember when I was younger, there was a similar kind of research of people who study in library and do their own research versus people who use Google. And they were claiming that people who use Google, they're less intelligent, which can be true because it makes you lazy. And one of the teachers, because we all solved the problems he gave us, was upset and started to almost call us a dump. And one of us asked, he said, why are you so much against Google? He gave us all the answers we need, and maybe you have to do better exercise. He said, I'm not against Google, but at least use it correctly. So then he teaches us for 20 minutes how to use the brackets, how to use the advanced settings, etc. So that's why when I was reading your blog, I was like, this is the norm. We should work like that. We should always leverage as much as possible this kind of tool. Because sometimes I feel ashamed with clients when I say, oh, it's impressive what you've done. Sometimes I'm ashamed to say, actually, that's what you liked was the result of the prompt. All my brain work that you almost ignored was not more added value for you. So it will not replace us. We still have to use our brain. It will not make us expert, but I think we have to use it, especially for the use case you've done. Like you, and I'm keen to know about the patching of the NUC because I have plenty of NUC here, not connected to internet. So please let us know. Sorry, I digressed.
No, that's good.
That's okay. That conforms to my co-pilot review of the, the episode. So we're
and what
reverting
people expect. So yeah,
norm.
no, it's all good.
So with all that said, I think it's a wrap for us. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you, David and Cyrus, for your contributions and expertise. We will see you in 2 weeks' time. So all that's left to say is goodbye and thank you from me.
Thank you.